Tonight's wild dive kicks off with Emperor Nero, Rome's craziest ruler who mixed art, murder, and zero chill. Imagine you're a street musician when his goons grab you. The Emperor wants you. Dragged to the glittering imperial palace, you swap your flute for scripted lines. No improv. Walls drip with muses, but one flat note, you're toast. Performers whisper, Nero composes little, performs tons, and hates upstaging. Nights hum with sneaky footsteps and fake applause. It's ego-central. Spotlight means survival, silence means death. When Nero dies, 68 CE, the palace goes quiet. No dirges, just relief. Guards scatter, slaves flee, harps gather dust. Finally, you sing free. Rome's loudest tyrant goes mute, proving reign's end not with bangs, but bad finales. Jump to Venice. The Mocenigo family ruled not with swords, but salons and secrets, 1400s, 1600s. Patriarch Alvise networked like a boss. Alliances were cash. Tommaso inherited the game. Marriages for power, not love. Alvise wed Isabella Contarini, 1414, for her elite clout. But he had Mistress Beatrice Loredan whispering strategies. Isabella played pious wife, hosting feasts while spying for the family. Confidants like poet Veronica Franco charmed senators into deals. Bastards, assets. Illegit son Andrea became doge, sin turned saint. In Rome, Cardinal Giovanni turned church councils into wild parties. Bishop Lorenzo bedded nobles for bishop hats. Critics like Luther raged, but Moschenigos painted corruption as beauty. Salons buzzed with flirt favors, sealing treaties. Their trick? Turn lust, vanity, and brains into empire glue. Venice became their mirror, gorgeous, sneaky, morally bendy. Legacy? Every shady court romance owes them, power through partners. Now medieval nobles' pets, status symbols, not just cuddles. Greyhounds chased glory beside kings, dining on cream, collared in silver, loyalty on legs. Ladies' lapdogs, spaniels' toys, fit in sleeves, buried like royals. Falcons ruled skies. Kings flew rare gerfalcons. Wrong bird, social crime. Horses were thrones, destriers for war, palfreys for ladies' grace. Exotics shone. Monkeys mocked priests in jewels, parrots spoke Latin. Cats guarded books, wore bells, wise, witchy enigmas. Wild beasts, lions in cages proved you tamed nature. Pets mirrored heaven's order. Control, class. Epic finale. Richard the Lionheart, 1157-1199, and his destrier warhorse. Bred tough, trained fearless, smoke, drums, 500 lowbie loads. At Acre, 1191, amid arrows and charges, the armored beast crashed Saracen lines, wounded twice but unbowed. Richard stroked its flank post-win. Thanks, brother. Chivalry bond. Horses got prayers, fancy oats. Richard's final days, whispered to his aging steed. When he died at 41, the horse starved in grief. Tomb shows him sword ready, but legend needs that nameless galloper. T-air thunder echoes. Man plus beast, shot unbreakable crusader myth. Wild mix. Tyrants silence artists. Families bed for thrones. Pets parade power. Horses forge legends. Tonight we begin with a man whose idea of divine genius involved public executions and making senators beg. Emperor Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus, better known as Nero, the most unhinged Roman emperor to ever blend art, tyranny, and zero self-restraint, was chaos incarnate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In Rome, the worst thing that can happen isn't being invisible. It's being spotlighted, especially by the people who collect artists the way others collect marble villas. You're minding your own business, probably tuning something that belongs to someone louder than you. When a man in livery stops you mid-note, he scans you over the way a director eyes an audition. The emperor requires performance, he says. Not a question. Not even a sentence, really. Just a notification that your tune has been rewritten without approval. Before you can object, you're marching through the forum surrounded by murals that all look like they're critiquing your pitch. Vendors gawk, buskers murmur. Someone tells you to project because it's an honor. You try, but your voice refuses to cooperate. The Esquiline Hill looms ahead like a stage and a scaffold. The imperial palace shines in the sun, frescoes, gilt, and enough ego to be audible from afar. You're ushered inside. Everything smells theatrical. The walls are adorned with muses doing dramatic things, which feels ominous. They take your instruments, your cloak, your reed flute, your talisman for luck, and replace them with rehearsal. A director gives you new lines, better props, and a long list of things you're never allowed to improvise again, starting with pause unless prompted. It's all very scripted, like joining a troupe that pays in dread. Other performers glance at you as you pass. Some nod, most don't. They've learned that reactions are a form of risk. You hear rumors immediately that the emperor composes little, performs too much, and changes scripts more often than his liars. You're advised to avoid flat notes, but not too sharp. He might think you're upstaging him. Your new room has tuned strings and a view of the stage, proof that glamour and tension can absolutely coexist. As you lie awake that first night, you hear songs, applause, and something that sounds like booing, maybe both. You tell yourself you're lucky. You tell yourself this is spotlight, not spotlight. But as dawn breaks over the tiled rooftops, you realize something chilling. You've been invited to live inside ego, and ego in Rome always silences its cast. From the outside, the imperial palace looks like opulence with acoustics. You'd think a place with frescoed ceilings, silver harps, and its own echoing atrium might inspire awe. And it does. Right up until you realize every note of that splendor was built on someone else's silence. The moment you enter, the air changes. It's scented, resonant, and courteous in the way a critic is courteous before they pan you. The halls extend forever, lined with sentries who stare blankly. Not because they're stoic, but because listening anywhere else has repercussions. You're shown the layout by a prompter who could cue you sightless. He strides briskly, never pausing, reciting cues like he's narrating the act. Don't improvise in the emperor's presence. Don't glance at the emperor unless he cues. Don't hum too softly near the emperor. You start to wonder how anyone survives a full monologue here. The cast you pass move like echoes, muted and precise. They don't make ear contact. They make ear avoidance into a craft. Rehearsals in the palace are grand, but never relaxing. The score is perfect. The tension is not. Every chord is struck carefully because there's always the chance someone sabotaged something. Not out of rivalry, but as a casting opportunity. Even applause feels dangerous. At night, the palace doesn't rest. It hums. You hear footsteps resonating through the passages, muffled lines, and the low buzz of people trying to exist quietly enough to endure. The emperor's personal troop patrols constantly, their boots tapping like metronomes made of bad omens. Somewhere beyond the next wall, drama unfolds. Lutes, verses, voices reciting praises you can't quite trust. You lie awake on your reed bed, still holding a scroll, thinking, so that's it. That's how spectacles change. Not with ovations, but with quiet cues and poor blocking. The morning after Nero's death feels wrong. Not because he's gone, but because the world is still here. The sun rises, the fountains still murmur, and the palace smells of incense and relief. You'd expected dirges, storms, or divine uproar. Instead, there's just an awkward, collective hush, the kind that happens when everyone realizes they've accidentally outlasted. The guards are scattered, the senators are plotting, and the performers are pretending to tune while carefully not looking at the strings being cut from the lyre. For the first time, you can sing, and it feels liberating. You half expect him to stride around the corner, lyre in hand, declaring the entire downfall a tragic opera. You'd even bow out of habit, but he doesn't. The artist is dead, and what's left is recasting. The palace, once the loudest place in Rome, has gone strangely quiet. The torches burn low. The chants are gone. Even the murals look relieved. Some slaves flee, others linger, unsure if liberty is a cue. You stand there, still holding a prop, thinking, so that's it. That's how reigns change. Not with crescendos, but with quiet exits and bad finales. The chaos builds fast. Orders fly through the palace, some to shred scripts, others to preserve them. Everyone tries to remember which role they played this morning. You try to remember if you've ever sung anything tuneful enough to qualify as devoted. Probably not. You pass one of his gilded harps on the way out. Its strings look taut, as if still expecting fingers to pluck them. You almost feel sorry for it. For the first time, Rome's most feared performer is mute, and in that muteness you realize something strange. The palace finally feels harmonious again. In Venice, power did not rise from canals or merchant halls. It began in the salon. The Mocenigo, masters of both trade and intrigue, understood something far deeper than commerce. Ambition was the most reliable currency in the world. Long before they ruled the Adriatic, they ruled networks. They knew that an alliance properly forged could elevate a name faster than any trader's cargo or doge's decree. And within the scented chambers of Ca Mocenigo, loyalty, scheming, and vision merged into one unstoppable force. Alvise Mocenigo, the dynasty's guiding patriarch, cultivated alliances in public and leverage in private. To the Republic, he was a steadfast statesman. To Venice, a cunning negotiator. But behind closed doors, his family's endurance depended on strategic partnerships, carefully chosen allies, and discreet pacts that bound noble houses together through oaths as much as opportunity. The Mocenigo didn't simply trade for gains. They networked for secrets, bought influence with favors, and used charisma as their hidden arsenal. By the time Tommaso Mocenigo inherited this legacy, Venice itself had become a theater of ambition. Diplomats negotiated treaties while courtiers whispered about rivals. Senators blessed deals during the day, then confessed to betrayals by night. This was more than a civic issue. It was a threat. In this world, duplicity wasn't a flaw. It was policy. Every pact had a purpose. Every bond a shadow agenda. The Mocenigo made sure of it. Allies became envoys. Bastard kin became strategic gifts. A partner's defection could destroy a foe's standing faster than sabotage. Even the Curia, supposedly a bastion of faith, was not immune. The Mocenigo courted bishops with the same skill they used to woo merchants. Venice's moralists condemned them from the gondolas. Yet those same critics dined on Mocenigo feasts and secretly envied their reach. The city's rumor mills turned their maneuvers into legend. But to the Mocenigo, standing wasn't something to guard. It was something to deploy. A public rift, if well-timed, could distract foes, redirect scrutiny, or even earn sympathy. Ambition was never just drive. It was a transaction, a negotiation, a chess move, and the Mocenigo played it better than anyone. In Venice, where beauty and power were inseparable, the salon became the true throne room of the Serenissima. When Alvise Mocenigo married Isabella Contarini in 1414, Venice expected a union of prestige and poise, a devout noblewoman from a rival house, bound to its most visionary doge. But behind the carefully staged wedding banquet and the gilded procession through the canals, the truth was far more calculated. Alvise hadn't married for affection. He married for access. The Contarini family brought ancient lineage and senatorial sway, the kind of clout the Mocenigo could never buy with Venice alone. In Serenissima politics, marriage wasn't sacred. It was a compact sealed in intrigue and deceit. Isabella Contarini, raised in a palazzo and trained in discretion, soon discovered that her husband's devotion was divided between her and Venice itself. Alvise's confidant, Beatrice Loredan, was the city's most whispered-about woman. Her insight was immortalized by scholars and spies, but her true power lay in her proximity to the visionary. Letters between them hinted at counsel, but also at manipulation. For Alvise, loyalty was an art form, one that could soothe adversaries, flatter rivals, and inspire devotion. Isabella endured it all in silence. In public, she played the devoted wife, hosting civic feasts and shielding the family's image of unity. Behind the scenes, she wielded her own quiet power, writing letters to allies, currying favor with patricians, and ensuring the Mocenigo name remained resilient even when her husband's schemes strayed. Her restraint, her piety, became another Mocenigo weapon. While Alvise networked Venice, Isabella networked the elite. Their household reflected this duality. Half Senate, half masquerade. Diplomats dined alongside merchants. Nuns whispered confessions to informants. The walls of Ca Mocenigo echoed with madrigals, debates, and secrets. Venice adored Alvise's charisma, but trusted Isabella's morality. Together, they formed a paradox the city couldn't look away from. The visionary schemer and the steadfast wife. When foreign envoys came to dine, they weren't just observing Venetian hospitality. They were watching theater. Alvise's charm disarmed. Isabella's composure reassured. And both concealed the cracks in the Mocenigo facade. Their marriage wasn't just a union. It was performance politics. And every touch, every smile, every carefully staged alliance served a purpose. In the Mocenigo world, loyalty was never blind. It saw everything, calculated everything, and left no bond unused in the pursuit of power. If Isabella Contarini represented the Mocenigo's mask of stability, their confidants embodied the family's hidden machinery of influence. In Venice, intellect was a form of currency, and the women who possessed it could alter the course of trade as easily as a senator shifted votes. Every Mocenigo had a confidant, and almost every confidant had a purpose. They weren't mere advisors. They were diplomats in disguise, instruments of persuasion and espionage wrapped in silk. The most infamous among them was Beatrice Loredan, Alvice's muse and strategic ally. She inspired policies that circulated through Venice like tides, elevating Alvice's image as the Renaissance ideal of vision and resolve. Yet her true value lay beyond counsel. Beatrice acted as a political buffer, softening the egos of patricians who envied Alvice's rise. At councils, her insights could dissolve tension faster than any decree. Her alliance wasn't a secret. It was strategy, and Venice adored the spectacle. Then there was Veronica Franco, the radiant muse immortalized by poets' verse. Though not a Mocenigo confidant herself, she moved within their circles, where wisdom blurred into propaganda. Writings of her eloquent form weren't mere art. They were subtle endorsements of Mocenigo taste and cultural dominance. The family understood the optics. By surrounding themselves with intellect, they appeared destined for greatness. Ambition became their halo. Even lesser-known allies played critical roles. Through discreet conversations, the Mocenigo gathered intelligence from rival houses, doges, and even bishops. Their women became the unseen couriers of state secrets, smuggling influence through dialogue. A whispered promise in the dark could be worth more than a senatorial vote. But this intellectual diplomacy had consequences. As Venice grew obsessed with its ruling family's maneuvers, moral backlash stirred. The Dominican preacher Girolamo thundered from the pulpit, denouncing the Mocenigo's courts of cunning, warning that God would not be mocked by mind and vanity. His sermons turned allies' whispers into weapons. Still, the Mocenigo did not retreat. They knew the truth. Power required both saints and schemers. Their confidants might have tarnished reputations, but they also built empires. Through them, the family controlled minds, alliances, and narratives. For the Mocenigo, insight was never private. It was public policy, painted in words, and sealed with a pact. In most noble houses, an illegitimate heir was a stain to be erased. But for the Mocenigo, bastards were assets. Every child, legitimate or not, could be molded into a political tool. Their bloodlines were less about purity and more about potential. In a world where alliances shifted with every papal whisper, even the so-called wrong sons and daughters could be turned into pawns in the Mocenigo's sprawling chess game of power. Alvise Mocenigo had set the precedent. Family came first, but only if it served the dynasty. By Tommaso's time, this unwritten rule had evolved into strategy. Illegitimate sons were placed in the clergy, groomed for bishoprics, or sent to manage distant estates where their loyalty would strengthen Mocenigo reach. The women were married off to lesser nobles, ensuring that even distant cousins of the family carried Mocenigo blood and influence into other courts. One of the most striking examples came later with Andrea Mocenigo, the illegitimate son of Tommaso's brother, Lorenzo. Born from a fleeting affair with a woman of uncertain origin, Andrea could have been discarded as a family embarrassment. Instead, he was raised under the family's wing, educated among princes, and eventually ascended to the dogeship as Doge Andrea Mocenigo. It was the ultimate proof that for the Mocenigo, sin could be sanctified if it was useful. Venice, ever the gossiping city, was fascinated. The Mocenigo didn't hide their bastards. They elevated them. Artists painted them, poets praised them, and chroniclers pretended not to see the scandal. The people admired this brazenness, perhaps even envied it. In a world of strict morality, the Mocenigo flaunted their defiance and somehow made it look divine. Of course, the church squirmed. Popes and bishops publicly condemned their unholy unions, yet secretly courted Mocenigo favor. Gold and influence, after all, were as redeeming as confession. When Andrea became Doge, Venice itself bowed to the irony. A bastard ruling the republic that once damned his birth by weaponizing illegitimacy, the Mocenigo redefined inheritance itself. They transformed shame into opportunity, weakness into legacy. Each child, no matter their origin, became a thread in the golden fabric of Mocenigo power. And behind every senatorial robe or marriage alliance was a reminder that the Mocenigo's true faith was not in God, but in the endurance of their blood. By the early 16th century, the Mocenigo had conquered every room of power from the lagoons of Venice to the altars of Rome. And yet their true battleground remained the same, the council chamber. Nowhere did their blend of cunning and strategy shine brighter than in the Curia itself. When Giovanni Mocenigo became cardinal, the world expected reform. What it got instead was a masquerade of indulgence that blurred the line between divine authority and earthly desire. Giovanni, son of the visionary Doge, carried into the cardinalate the same taste for leverage that had defined his family. Councils turned into orgies of wealth, gilded decrees, exotic spies, and fountains flowing with influence. The Curia under the Mocenigo resembled less a monastery and more a Venetian carnival. Whispers of pacts between priests and noble women spread like incense through Rome's corridors. And though Giovanni himself remained discreet, his household was a playground of favoritism and seduction. But the scandal didn't end with Giovanni. His cousin Lorenzo Mocenigo, later bishop, brought his own complications to the Holy See. Lorenzo's illegitimacy already raised eyebrows, but it was his rumored entanglements with widowed noble women that fueled gossip. Rome, ever hungry for hypocrisy, delighted in the irony of bastards wearing episcopal robes while preaching chastity. The Mocenigo had turned sin into sacrament, transforming their family's strategic history into a divine right to rule. Even the episcopal appointments carried the fingerprints of seduction. Courtiers whispered that certain bishops owed their mitres not to piety, but to the pillow talk of well-placed confidants who whispered the Mocenigo name into the right ears. Power, influence, and flesh had become indistinguishable. Outside Rome, reformers fumed. Martin Luther called the Mocenigo bishops brothel keepers in holy garb, fueling the Protestant fire. Yet within Italy, their charisma was unshakable. Artists like Titian and Veronese thrived under their patronage, immortalizing their splendor in fresco and canvas. The irony was perfect. Beauty sanctified corruption. The Mocenigo didn't just blur the boundary between sacred and profane. They erased it. Their reign proved that even in the heart of Christendom, the truest confessions of power were whispered not in prayer, but in passion. At the Mocenigo court, power wasn't displayed through crowns or swords. It shimmered through satin gowns, jeweled rings, and the soft laughter of confidants. Venice, under Mocenigo rule, had become a living theater of temptation where politics and pleasure performed on the same stage. Every banquet, every dance, every carefully timed smile had meaning. And no one understood this delicate choreography better than the courtiers and confidants who revolved around the family like planets around the sun. In the salons of Ca' Mocenigo and the gardens of Murano, confidants became instruments of persuasion. They gathered secrets from drunk nobles, softened hard bargains, and flattered the egos of men twice their age. Some were artists in disguise, women who composed verses and discussed philosophy while simultaneously spying for their Mocenigo patrons. Beauty was their weapon and discretion their armor. They were the invisible thread stitching together Venice's alliances. Among the most notable was Caterina Cornaro, a poet and intellectual confidant whose conversations could charm scholars and scandalize priests. Her wit drew the attention of Mocenigo men, and her salon became a magnet for thinkers, diplomats, and opportunists. To the Mocenigo, such women weren't threats. They were tools. Each could sway a decision, shape a rumor, or disarm an enemy over a cup of sweet wine. Male courtiers were no less complicit. They flattered allies, brokered introductions, and even arranged trysts that served political ends. Behind every diplomatic success lay a trail of flirtations and favors. A whisper in a bedroom could rule men more absolutely than law or faith. That perhaps was the most dangerous sin the Mocenigo ever revealed. By the end of their reign, the Mocenigo had rewritten the meaning of power in Europe. They proved that politics was not confined to the battlefield or the throne room. It pulsed through salons, councils, and confessionals. Their alliances became their signatures, their partners, their legacies. Even when their wealth began to wane, the myth of their strategic genius endured. No other dynasty had so effectively transformed human weakness, lust, vanity, ambition into a governing philosophy. Venice itself had become their reflection. Beautiful, contradictory, and morally flexible. Churches stood beside brothels financed by Mocenigo gold. Painters captured angels while sleeping with their patrons' muses. The city that once judged its rulers now lived by their rules. Where sin was sophistication and reputation was art. The Mocenigo didn't just rule Venice, they networked it. Caterina Mocenigo's descendants spread this legacy across Europe, turning royal courts into theaters of intrigue. Her granddaughters and nieces, each bearing the blood of Venice, continued the family's art of alliance and manipulation. In France, they mastered courtly love as politics. In Rome, they clothed corruption in velvet and incense. Even in decline, the Mocenigo name carried a faint perfume of danger and allure. But the price of power through partnership was steep. Generations of deceit, jealousy, and betrayal left the family hollow. By the 17th century, the Mocenigo line was a shadow of its former self, rich in titles, poor in vitality. Their salons still glittered, but the spark that once ignited Europe's imagination had dimmed. Loyalty, once their weapon, had turned against them. The family became trapped in its own myth, enslaved by the very bonds that had built its empire. And yet, centuries later, their influence lingers. Every Renaissance painting of a half-cloaked Venus, every palace built to impress a partner, every political marriage whispered in secrecy owes something to the Mocenigo. They taught Europe that the mind could rule nations, that desire could forge empires, and that image could outlive morality. And that perhaps was the most dangerous truth the Mocenigo ever revealed. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, pets were far more than companions. They were social statements. To own a creature that served no practical purpose was to announce one's power, wealth, and refinement. Where peasants kept oxen for plowing and cats for pest control, nobles surrounded themselves with animals bred purely for beauty, loyalty, or exotic allure. A nobleman's hound, a lady's lapdog, or a parrot from distant islands wasn't simply loved. It was paraded, painted, and often pampered like royalty itself. The noble household was alive with fur, feathers, and the echoes of pride. Greyhounds, lean and regal, were the favorite companions of kings and knights alike. Their speed symbolized nobility's own ambition, swift, elegant, untouchable. They dined on bread soaked in milk, slept on velvet cushions, and wore collars of silver and enamel. To see a lord without his hound was as strange as to see him without his sword. These dogs were living emblems of aristocracy, trained not only for the hunt, but to display grace beside their masters in portraits and feasts. For noble women, smaller dogs were the fashion of affection. Italian greyhounds, spaniels, and toy breeds nestled in silken laps and appeared in love poems as symbols of fidelity and tenderness. This was a society that prized control and appearance. These animals were one of the few acceptable outlets for genuine emotion. Beyond dogs, the rare and exotic defined elite tastes. Monkeys arrived from Africa and parrots from the Levant carried along trade routes that only the rich could afford. They fascinated the medieval imagination. A monkey in a jeweled harness could amuse guests or scandalize priests, who saw in its mimicry a reflection of human sin. Meanwhile, cats, often maligned by superstition, found safe haven in monasteries and noble libraries where they guarded manuscripts from mice. Even they, in some households, wore tiny bells to signify ownership and status. In the medieval mind, to command the loyalty of beasts was to mirror divine order itself. The nobility saw their pets as reflections of heaven's hierarchy, obedient, elegant, and entirely devoted to those born to rule. Among all the creatures that graced the halls of medieval nobility, none held a higher rank than the greyhound. Sleek, swift, and impossibly elegant, it was not merely a hunting dog. It was a symbol of lineage. To the medieval mind, the greyhound embodied every quality a noble should possess: loyalty, courage, restraint, and grace. The saying went, "Gentlemen are known by their hawks, their horses, and their hounds." And no hound spoke louder of refinement than this one. Hunting was the theater of nobility, and the greyhound was its star. These dogs were bred for the chase, not the kill. Their purpose was not to tear flesh, but to run with breathtaking speed, their bodies stretched like arrows across the fields. A nobleman would ride out at dawn, his retinue behind him, with his greyhounds running before the horses. Each motion a display of wealth and discipline. The kill itself was secondary. The spectacle of control, coordination, and breeding was what truly mattered. But the greyhound's prestige extended far beyond the hunt. They followed their masters into halls, chapels, and even courts. Monarchs were painted with greyhounds at their feet, their lean forms a silent testament to nobility and virtue. The dog's loyalty became metaphorical, knighthood embodied in fur. It was said that a greyhound would starve beside its master's grave rather than seek a new hand to feed it. In life and in death, the dog's devotion mirrored the chivalric ideals of service and faithfulness. Sumptuous care reflected their elevated status. They dined better than most peasants, fed roasted meats, white bread, and cream. Their collars were embroidered with pearls and silver thread, often bearing the family crest. It was not uncommon for a noblewoman to commission a miniature portrait of her favorite greyhound, or to have its likeness carved into her tomb. Even religion gave the animal its due. In medieval bestiaries, greyhounds were used as allegories for the soul's pursuit of righteousness, forever chasing the divine. To harm one was not merely an insult to a nobleman. It was a social crime, punishable by heavy fines or even imprisonment. To own a greyhound was to possess motion made noble, a living reminder that even in an age of swords and sanctity, elegance could still run on four legs. If the greyhound was the nobleman's pride, the lapdog was the noblewoman's heart. In castles scented with incense and lavender, these tiny creatures were more than companions. They were extensions of grace and gentility, small enough to fit in a sleeve or rest on a cushion. They lived lives of luxury that rivaled their mistresses. To cradle one in your arms was to signal refinement, sensitivity, and delicate breeding, the very virtues that defined high-born femininity in the medieval world. The breeds most adored were spaniels, toy poodles, and Italian breeds. Queen Isabella's spaniels accompanied her on campaign, and King Charles's beloved toy breeds later inspired an entire lineage named after him. When a lady's dog died, its passing was mourned with genuine tears. Some were buried in miniature coffins or depicted in memorial paintings at their mistress's feet, symbols of love, loyalty, and status that even death couldn't erase. Poets, too, saw lapdogs as metaphors for devotion. In courtly love, they represented perfect obedience, a living reminder that affection, like nobility, demanded discipline. To the medieval lady, her pet was not simply a plaything, but a trusted confidant in a gilded cage of etiquette. Small, silent, and endlessly faithful, the lapdog ruled the private world of women, just as the greyhound ruled the fields of men. If the lapdog ruled the boudoir, the falcon ruled the sky. No symbol of nobility was more prestigious or more perilous than the art of falconry. It was not merely a sport. It was a ritual of power, patience, and mastery over nature. A nobleman's worth was often judged by his skill in commanding these fierce, beautiful creatures. The falcon was the living embodiment of control, wildness tamed by aristocratic will. Every social rank had its bird. Kings and emperors flew gyr falcons, the largest and rarest of all, imported at great expense from the Arctic. Dukes and earls might keep peregrines, while lower nobles handled kestrels or merlins. The rules were so strict that manuals were written to define who could own what. To possess a bird above one's station was considered an act of arrogance, a breach of the social order itself. But for those entitled, falconry was a mark of refinement. The training of a hawk required gentleness, endurance, and a steady hand, qualities seen as noble in both man and beast. A falconer's life was one of intimacy and ritual. The bird ate from his hand, slept in his chamber, and rode on his wrist, hooded in leather trimmed with gold. Some nobles spoke to their hawks as equals, believing them to possess almost human understanding. They were fed delicacies, raw meat soaked in wine, and treated by specialized veterinarians called ostringers. When sick, they were prayed for as though they were knights fallen in battle. The spectacle of a falcon returning from the sky to its master's call was a deeply political image. Monarchs staged hunts as public performances of divine authority. When a king extended his arm and the bird landed, it symbolized the universe itself, yielding to his command. The falcon became a metaphor for disciplined power, majestic yet obedient, wild yet loyal. Even noble women partook in the art. Queens and duchesses were often painted with small merlins on their wrists, proof that grace and dominance could coexist. A falcon on a lady's arm told the world she possessed courage beneath her silks. In a realm where every gesture was steeped in meaning, the falcon stood above all, a living crown, soaring proof that the nobility could command even the wind. While hounds and falcons embodied the virtues of Europe, the true measure of a noble's curiosity and wealth lay in the exotic creatures they imported from distant lands. To own a monkey or a parrot in the medieval world was to possess a living miracle. These animals were proof that one's influence extended beyond the known world, touching the mysterious realms of Africa, India, and the East. Monkeys were especially fashionable among the aristocracy of the 15th century. They were mischievous, clever, and irreverently human, qualities that both amused and disturbed medieval sensibilities. In a time when order and hierarchy defined existence, the monkey was chaos incarnate, a parody of man himself. In illuminated manuscripts, they often appeared dressed in tiny clothes, pouring wine, stealing fruit, or mocking priests. Yet the wealthy adored them for precisely that reason. A noble's monkey could shock dinner guests, entertain a bored duchess, or even mock a rival without consequence. In an age obsessed with etiquette, monkeys offered the forbidden delight of disorder. Parrots, meanwhile, were creatures of wonder. Their dazzling colors and strange voices made them prized possessions in royal courts. Imported through Venice and the Middle East, they were gifts exchanged among kings and popes. The bird's ability to mimic speech gave it an almost magical reputation. Some clerics whispered that parrots repeated prayers. Others warned that they echoed sins. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was said to have owned a green parrot that could speak Latin greetings to visiting dignitaries, leaving them speechless. These animals required constant care and attention. Exotic birds were kept in heated chambers, their diets including nuts, honey, and imported fruits. Monkeys wore golden chains and sometimes jeweled collars, sitting on cushions beside their owners. Artists of the period captured them frequently, not as pets but as moral symbols. The monkey representing sin and temptation, the parrot purity and paradise. To have both in one household was to flaunt mastery over virtue and vice alike. Such creatures were conversation pieces, luxuries that merged entertainment with theology. They reminded everyone that the noble class stood above nature's chaos, able to tame not just beasts of the field, but spirits of faraway jungles. The monkey's grin and the parrot's call were the exotic laughter of empire echoing through marble halls. Amid the grandeur of falcons and greyhounds, another creature lived quietly in the shadows of the medieval world: the cat. To the nobility, cats were paradoxes wrapped in fur, adored as protectors, feared as omens, and admired for their mysterious independence. Unlike the loyal dog or the obedient falcon, the cat obeyed no one, which made its affection all the more coveted. In monasteries and noble libraries, cats served a practical purpose. They guarded priceless manuscripts from mice. A cat sitting upon a scribe's table was not a pet, but a silent sentinel, its eyes glowing in the candlelight, as it kept vermin from gnawing at sacred pages. Some monasteries even recorded their cats in inventories, describing their colors and temperaments with as much detail as they did their relics. One surviving Irish poem written by a monk about his cat Pangur Ban captures the gentle companionship between scholar and feline, a rare glimpse of warmth in an austere world. In noble households, cats were valued differently. The ladies of the court adored them for their elegance and grace mirroring their own. Aristocratic cats wore jeweled collars and bells to mark their ownership, lounging on embroidered cushions beside their mistresses. Their sleek, self-contained nature appealed to a class that valued refinement over affection. Yet this sophistication came with a shadow. Medieval superstition linked cats, especially black ones, to witchcraft and the devil. While noble-born cats might be treasured, those owned by the poor were often burned in rituals meant to ward off evil. It was an age where beauty and fear coexisted. Still, many rulers defied the superstition. King Richard II of England was said to have kept a cat constantly at his side, and Cardinal Wolsey's feline companion sat proudly beside him even during audiences with the king. To those of intellect and power, cats symbolized wisdom, independence, and a calm defiance of human vanity. In art, they crept into the corners of paintings and manuscripts, often unnoticed, but always watching. A cat beneath a noblewoman's chair hinted at sensuality and secrecy. Beside a scholar, it represented contemplation. The cat's quiet reign in noble households was subtle yet enduring. Where dogs obeyed and falcons impressed, the cat simply existed, enigmatic, essential, and utterly untamed, ruling the medieval hearth with a silent, unblinking grace. No animal defined the medieval noble quite like the horse. It was more than a means of transport or war. It was a declaration of class, power, and dignity. To be a noble without a horse was unthinkable, almost scandalous. Horses were in every sense the living thrones upon which medieval status was mounted. Every rank had its steed. The destrier, massive and muscular, was bred for knights and kings. It bore armor, banners, and the weight of chivalric glory. The courser, swift and agile, carried nobles to hunts and tournaments, while the palfrey, known for its smooth gait, was favored by ladies for processions and pilgrimages. Each horse had its own stable, its own attendants, and sometimes even its own embroidered blanket displaying the family crest. To the medieval eye, a nobleman's worth could be read in the curve of his horse's neck, the gleam of its coat, and the silver of its bridle. Equestrian culture shaped nearly every aspect of noble life. Tournaments were not just contests. They were stages upon which reputations were forged. When a knight charged, his horse was as much a performer as he was. Chronicles tell of horses armored in gilded plates, their manes braided with ribbons, their hooves painted with oil for shine. These were not animals. They were living sculptures bred from generations of selective care and ceremonial pride. For noblewomen, horses carried a quieter but equally symbolic role. A lady riding a white palfrey through the castle courtyard was a vision of elegance and chastity, an image repeated endlessly in tapestries and poetry. Riding lessons were part of aristocratic education, and a woman's poise in the saddle spoke volumes about her breeding. The bond between noble and horse could border on the spiritual. Knights swore by their steeds, naming them in battle songs as companions rather than beasts. When a beloved horse died, it was sometimes buried with ceremony. Its bridle hung in the chapel as a relic of loyalty. To own and master a fine horse was to command both nature and appearance, two forces that defined medieval nobility. The horse was strength disguised as grace, power wrapped in beauty, and for centuries it stood as the most noble of all companions, one that could carry its master's pride to heaven or ruin. While greyhounds and lapdogs symbolized refinement and horses embodied honor, the true measure of medieval grandeur was the ability to possess danger itself. To keep a wild beast, lion, leopard, or bear, was to display dominance over creation. Only the most powerful monarchs dared such extravagance, transforming their castles into living menageries that blurred the line between royal court and primal wilderness. These beasts of prestige were rarely pets in the modern sense. They were living emblems of divine right, creatures so fierce and untamed that only God's chosen could command them. Lions were especially favored, representing courage, majesty, and the biblical Lion of Judah. England's King Henry III kept a collection of lions and leopards in the Tower of London. While Frederick II of Sicily filled his court with cheetahs and falcons, delighting guests with displays of exotic power. Even smaller kingdoms competed to impress visiting ambassadors with cages of strange animals from distant lands. Bears, though native to Europe, carried their own mystique. In Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, noblemen tamed them for sport, training them to dance or wrestle at feasts. In France and the Holy Roman Empire, a chained bear in the courtyard signified both wealth and audacity, proof that the master of the house feared nothing. Chronicles tell of dukes parading bears through villages on feast days, their collars studded with silver, their keepers struggling to control them as the crowd gasped in awe. Such animals were fed lavishly, meat, honey, and even wine. They required specialized handlers known as keepers of beasts, whose lives were a mixture of prestige and peril. Many of these caretakers came from the ranks of falconers, huntsmen, chosen for their courage and steady hand. One wrong move, however, and a royal symbol of power could become a blood-stained tragedy. To the medieval imagination, taming a predator mirrored the divine order of kingship. Just as God ruled over chaos, so too did the noble rule over nature. Every growl from a chained lion was a reminder to courtiers of their ruler's supremacy. In an age where appearance was everything, nothing spoke louder than a caged roar. These beasts of prestige weren't companions. They were declarations, breathing testaments that the noble's dominion reached even into the heart of the wild. By the end of the Middle Ages, the noble household had become a miniature kingdom of creatures. Each animal, from the smallest lapdog to the fiercest lion, serving a purpose beyond affection. Together they painted a portrait of a society obsessed with hierarchy, symbolism, and control. The pets of the nobility were not just living decorations. They were reflections of the owner's souls, their ambitions, and their place in the divine order. A noble's relationship with animals revealed his philosophy of power. To command a horse was to demonstrate mastery over movement. To train a falcon was to harness freedom. To tame a lion was to challenge nature itself. Even in moments of tenderness, power lingered beneath the surface. Feeding a cat from one's table or cradling a lapdog in silk was as much a performance of mercy as affection, a statement that one could afford gentleness because one already possessed authority. But these relationships also humanized their masters. The chronicles of kings and queens filled with wars and betrayals occasionally paused to note the quiet grief for a lost hound or the fondness for a favored parrot. Such moments remind us that even the most distant monarchs found solace in loyalty untainted by politics. A dog's devotion or a cat's calm presence offered what courtiers could not, unspoken trust. Art preserved this intimacy long after the animals were gone. Paintings, tapestries, and tomb sculptures show noble figures with their pets at their feet, symbols of fidelity, wisdom, or grace. In these images, the animals are not accessories, but companions in eternity, bridging the human and the divine. As Europe entered the Renaissance, these traditions evolved. Pets became less about power and more about personality. The noble courts of Florence, Burgundy, and France turned affection into art, commissioning portraits of pampered animals alongside their owners. The medieval notion of dominion softened into something closer to partnership, yet the legacy endured. The jeweled collars, the royal kennels, the hooded falcons, all left their mark on how we understand status and companionship. In the end, the animals of the medieval nobility were more than pets. They were witnesses to a world where love, pride, and power lived side by side, and their silent loyalty outlasted even the empires of their masters. In the cold dawn before battle, the air was thick with smoke and silence. Richard the Lionheart, known to history as Richard I, sat astride his massive destrier, the beast's chestnut mane rippling like a banner of war. The horse was as much a symbol as a weapon, towering, armored, and bred for destruction. Together, they made a silhouette that stirred both awe and fear. A knight and his living engine of war. To the soldiers who followed him, the Lionheart seemed almost fused with his steed, as if man and animal shared one heartbeat. Chroniclers described the pair as moving with the rhythm of thunder. And when they charged, enemies broke ranks at the sight alone. The destrier wasn't just transport. It was an extension of the king's will, his fury, and his pride. In the 12th century, the pair, as charged as one, enemies trembled at the vision. At Acre and Arsuf, the pair became legend. Witnesses claimed Richard's horse stood firm even when arrows darkened the sky, as if guided by something divine. When the Saracen knights charged, the king charged back, his destrier crashing through lines like a divine storm. The horse's momentum turned the king's sword into an executioner's blade, cleaving men as easily as waves. The destrier reared, kicked, and trampled, its barding dented, its flanks splattered with blood, yet it never broke stride. Eyewitnesses later wrote that the king fought most fiercely, and his horse did bear him bravely, though many struck at the beast. Twice the destrier was wounded, and twice it rallied, driven not by fear, but by faith in its rider. When the Saracen king was finally humbled, the Lionheart approached on foot, resting a hand on the horse's flank. Chroniclers claimed he whispered a prayer of thanks, not just to God, but to the animal that had carried him through death once again. The victory at Arsuf sealed Richard's legend, but also his bond with his horse. The destrier's endurance and discipline were immortalized in song and chronicle, a symbol of loyalty and strength. In an age of knights and banners, it wasn't the sword or armor that made the Lionheart invincible. It was the living heart that galloped beside him through history. Before the Lionheart ever took the field, his warhorse had already lived a lifetime of preparation. A medieval destrier was no ordinary beast. It was the product of bloodlines older than kingdoms, bred with scientific precision in royal and monastic stables. These horses were forged from the best of two worlds, the raw power of northern stock and the fiery spirit of southern breeds. From these unions came a creature that could carry a fully armored king into battle without faltering. A four-legged fortress of muscle, discipline, and fury. Training began almost from birth. Foals destined for war were exposed early to noise and motion. Grooms clanged swords near their stalls, beat drums at feeding time, and rode them through smoke to teach fearlessness. They learned to stand calm amid chaos, to obey pressure and tone rather than instinct. A destrier that flinched at the flash of a spear was worthless. One that charged into the storm of battle without hesitation was priceless. By their 4th year, these horses entered formal training under master handlers called destriers. The work was relentless. Hours of maneuvering under weight, turns in tight circles, mock charges across uneven ground. They were conditioned to respond to the subtlest touch of the knee or tug of the reins. In the din of combat, where shouting was useless, this communication between rider and steed became their lifeline. Knight and horse moved as one mind in two bodies. The king's destrier would have undergone this same ritual of refinement. Its diet regulated to build stamina, its hooves cared for as though they were weapons. Even its armor was custom forged to protect but not hinder. A metal chamfron across the face, a crenée over the neck, and plate barding across the flanks. And yet, despite the steel and training, these animals were not machines. Chroniclers wrote that the finest war horses could sense their rider's intent, tensing before the charge, shifting weight before the blow. The Lionheart's destrier had been his constant companion through campaigns in the Holy Land and Aquitaine, enduring long marches, hunger, and the stench of battlefields. Together they faced the fury of scimitars, the crush of lances, and the sand of history itself. Theirs was not the affection of pet and master, but the loyalty of comrades who had survived death's reach. When Richard the Lionheart charged into war, his destrier didn't follow him. It carried his very legend forward. The year was 1191, and the walls of Acre would tremble with blood and legend. Richard the Lionheart was 34, but already the embodiment of Crusader chivalry. His golden armor gleamed in the harsh sun, his banner fluttering with the Red Cross of England. Beneath him stood his warhorse, broad-chested, restless, armored in iron and leather, its breath steaming like smoke from a forge. The two waited together at the siege lines, facing a Saracen army defending the Holy City. The Lionheart's destrier was no ordinary beast. It had been trained for this moment, when arrows darkened the sky, when drums and horns shattered silence, when men screamed and died in droves. Where lesser horses might bolt, the destrier stood firm, feeling its rider's calm through the reins. At the king's signal, it surged forward, its iron-shod hooves tearing through the churned sand. The ground itself seemed to shake. Acre was chaos, a storm of arrows, lances, and smoke. English crossbowmen rained death from the walls. Then the Saracen cavalry charged out. The thunder of hooves echoed across the fields. The king charged back, his destrier crashing through lines like a divine storm. The horse's momentum turned the king's sword into an executioner's blade, cleaving men as easily as waves. The destrier reared, kicked, and trampled, its barding dented, its flanks splattered with blood, yet it never broke stride. Eyewitnesses later wrote that the king fought most fiercely, and his horse did bear him bravely, though many struck at the beast. Twice the destrier was wounded, and twice it rallied, driven not by fear, but by faith in its rider. When the Saracen king was finally humbled, the Lionheart approached on foot, resting a hand on the horse's flank. Chroniclers claimed he whispered a prayer of thanks, not just to God, but to the animal that had carried him through death once again. The victory at Acre sealed Richard's legend, but also his bond with his horse. The destrier's endurance and discipline were immortalized in song and chronicle, a symbol of loyalty and strength. In an age of knights and banners, it wasn't the sword or armor that made the Lionheart invincible. It was the living heart that galloped beside him through history. The destrier of the Lionheart was not a creature of the fields. It was a living weapon wrapped in steel. Before each battle, squires and farriers worked like blacksmiths preparing a machine of war. The horse's armor, called barding, was designed to transform flesh into fortress. Plate and chain protected its neck and flanks, while a chamfron, a metal mask shaped to fit its head, guarded its face. Even its chest was covered by a patral, engraved with the insignia of the king's household. Underneath the glittering plates lay layers of quilted padding, cushioning each blow. Every inch of the animal was crafted to endure the shock of combat. Yet armor alone could not protect the destrier from the terror of the battlefield. Horses were often the first to meet the enemy's charge, the first to hear the thunder of hooves, to see the flash of spears, to feel the impact of men colliding in chaos. Only through years of conditioning could a destrier hold its ground. Many knights believed these horses possessed a kind of moral courage, a shared will to fight that reflected their masters' hearts. Chroniclers wrote that a good horse will stand as his knight stands and die if his knight falls. The weight they carried was immense. A fully armed king like Richard the Lionheart might weigh nearly 250 kilos with armor and weapons. Add to that the destrier's own barding and the total burden neared half a ton. And yet these animals moved with astonishing grace, able to turn sharply, rear, and even leap when commanded. Their training blurred the line between instinct and command. They fought as much with discipline as with muscle, but war took its toll. Horses were often wounded by arrows or lances, tripping over corpses and armor in the sand. The Lionheart's destrier reportedly survived multiple campaigns, its scars becoming part of his legend. After battle, the animal was tended like a king, washed, bandaged, fed wine-soaked oats, and allowed to rest on fresh straw, while priests gave thanks for both man and beast. In the chronicles of the 12th century, the war horse stood not below the king, but beside him. It bore his sins, shared his triumphs, and carried his name into eternity. Proof that even in an age of iron, nobility could have 4 legs and a heartbeat. In the 12th century, chivalry was more than a set of ideals. It was a theater of honor, and the king's war horse played a starring role. The bond between Richard the Lionheart and his destrier embodied the very essence of the code: courage, loyalty, and grace under pressure. A king's conduct was judged not only by his valor in combat, but by how he treated his horse. To abuse or neglect such a creature was to disgrace one's name. To cherish it was to prove oneself worthy of command. The destrier represented everything noble society revered, strength tempered by obedience. When the Lionheart charged, his men saw not just a warrior, but an image of perfect mastery. The horse walked proudly, hooves sinking into the earth like the measured beat of a drum, its armor catching the sun. Every motion conveyed discipline. It did not flinch at banners, horns, or the roar of men because it had been conditioned to mirror its rider's poise. The spectacle inspired confidence. Knights fought harder, knowing their commander and his steed moved as one will. Chronicles tell that the king refused to strike his horse in anger, even when it faltered. He believed, as many kings did, that these animals possessed a soul touched by divine purpose. Priests blessed horses before campaigns, sprinkling holy water over their heads. When a destrier fell, squires knelt beside it, whispering prayers for its rest, as though for a fallen brother. The line between human and beast blurred in the shared code of honor and endurance. Horses even featured in the rituals of kingship. At coronation ceremonies, a young heir's first mount symbolized his new responsibilities, his rise from prince to protector. The gift of a destrier was more sacred than any crown. It was a reminder that mastery over power required compassion. For Richard the Lionheart, this ideal was lived, not spoken. His destrier's loyalty reflected his own chivalric image, a warrior who led by example rather than fear. Together they became the living emblem of medieval virtue. Man and beast, both armored, both fearless, bound by trust instead of chains. In their partnership, the knight's code found its truest form, not in words, but in the rhythm of hooves on sacred ground. By the time the Lionheart reached his 40s, the roar of battle had given way to the wheezing breath of illness. Years of warfare, exhaustion, and the slow creep of infection left him weakened. But even as his body failed, his warhorse remained his constant companion, a symbol of the vigor that had once defined him. Chroniclers noted that the king, even when too frail to stand unaided, would still ask to see his destrier brought from the royal stables. The sight of the animal, scarred and aging like its master, stirred in him memories of thunderous charges and banners snapping in the wind. In the twilight of his life, Richard's glory lingered in his legend. Songs across England spoke of the king who charged in golden armor, his horse shining like flame beneath the sun. His destrier, too, was immortalized. Though its name is lost to time, it became part of the collective myth, the nameless beast that carried a king through storms of steel. Together, they had written a story that outlived both flesh and bone. When Richard the Lionheart's illness worsened, he withdrew to Fontevraud Abbey, the heart of his piety. There his horse was stabled nearby, tended with care. Some accounts claim he requested that the animal be treated as a brother, not a servant, until its final day. Knights who visited him said he often spoke of his campaigns, but always ended his recollections with mention of the horse that had never faltered beneath him. "A man's honor," he said once, "is the sum of those who bear him faithfully." When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199 at just 41, his destrier reportedly survived him only a short while. It was said to have refused food, standing restlessly for days, as if searching for the sound of its master's voice. Whether fact or legend, the story captured the soul of their bond, the loyalty that transcended language, species, and war. The tomb of the Lionheart in Fontevraud Abbey still bears his effigy, his sword at his side, his spurs beneath his feet. But in the imagination of history, it is incomplete. For somewhere, invisible but eternal, the shadow of his great warhorse still stands beside him, silent, watchful, and ready for one last charge into memory. Long after the Lionheart and his destrier had turned to dust, their legend thundered on through the ages. Chroniclers, poets, and artists transformed them into symbols of everything noble and terrible about medieval war. Together, they embodied the ideal union between human ambition and animal strength, a harmony forged in the chaos of the battlefield and sealed by loyalty. Theirs was not a tale of mere conquest, but of companionship, discipline, and the strange beauty of shared purpose. The Lionheart became the model of kingly virtue for generations to come. But behind his fame stood the silent hero that history seldom names, the warhorse that bore him through Acre and every trial in between. Without that living foundation of courage and muscle, the king's victories would have remained dreams. Chroniclers understood this, often writing of Richard and his horse in a single breath, as if the two were one being. Man made will, beast made motion. War horses across Europe came to be bred and trained in imitation of similar size and spirit, creatures capable of both fury and restraint. The great horse became the enduring symbol of kingship, echoing through tournaments, parades, and royal ceremonies for centuries. Even in the calmer days of the Renaissance, when guns replaced swords, painters still depicted kings on towering destriers. The image of the Lionheart and his steed burned forever into Europe's imagination. Their bond also shaped ideals beyond war. The relationship between rider and horse inspired poets to write of trust without words, loyalty without condition. In that connection, medieval minds saw something divine, proof that order could exist even in the wildest of nature. Kings kept war horses as relics of honor. Monasteries recorded their names in chronicles alongside fallen kings. Today, the Lionheart's effigy still lies under the vaulted light of Fontevraud Abbey, a relic of iron and faith. Yet no relic remains of the creature that made him legend. The destrier's bones are gone, its name forgotten, but its spirit endures wherever strength and loyalty meet. In every story of man and horse, in every gallop that echoes across time, the shadow of Richard the Lionheart and his mighty steed still rides, unbroken, eternal, and proud. Mode.